My name is Anne Lausch. For those of you who don't know me, I teach German and German language and translation here at West End, and I'm very excited to introduce Mathias Schulze from the Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies at the University of Waterloo. And looking at Professor Schulze's online profiles, I realized that he's interested in a great many things, but most of them seem to have something to do with language learning, and grammar. His research focus is the application of linguistic theory to computer-assisted language learning. He has developed several distance education courses for elementary and intermediate German at university, and has published on language technology and the acquisition of grammar through intelligent computer-assisted language learning. Currently, he's working on the computational implementation of German grammar, computerized adaptive language testing, and the online teaching and learning of German. I hope I got all this more or less right. And so please join me in welcoming Mathias Schulze.
Thank you very much. I guess I need to update my webpage. That's the first thing I was thinking of. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a great pleasure to be here and have the chance to speak to you. When Henri invited me, I told him, I said, usually when I talk about things, it has some kind of techie element to it, and I asked him whether that would be all right for you. And he said yes, so I just kind of went right ahead and picked that topic. So I'm going to talk about a couple of more practical aspects of online language learning in the next kind of 40-45 minutes or so. I'm planning this. I'll give you my conceptualization of online language learning. This is mainly about course design. We're just in the middle of one of those projects, redesigning or developing beginners and intermediate level language courses for our students of German. I'll give you a little bit of theoretical background as well, but I'll keep that short. And then I'll try to kind of broaden the perspective, because I'm a great believer in kind of teaching a foreign language. It doesn't seem to matter that much what the foreign language is. We do have a lot in common. We share a lot of challenges, problems, also successes, of course. So it always pays, in my opinion, to kind of look beyond one individual language and see, how can this be transferred? What is applicable to the teaching of other languages with its very different, often very different constituency. To start off very broadly, computer-assisted language learning is pretty much my kind of main research area. One way of looking at it is a relatively young field. If you compare it to other academic fields of inquiry, pretty much started in the second half of the 20th century. It's pretty much a kind of Cold War product in many ways. People looked at these computers very early on. This wasn't just kind of for playing chess and crunching numbers. Language was on board very, very early on, thinking, we can use these machines for linguistic purposes, basically. And the first one was machine translation. When that didn't produce the results that some researchers at least had kind of boasted about in the early days of machine translation, governments, both, interestingly enough, the American government as well as the government of the Soviet Union, realized, well, we're pumping a lot of money in this machine translation. This is not paying off. Let's cut them off. And then that was a short period of time when a lot of money actually went into language teaching, but it was mainly for kind of technology-related projects. That's when the field pretty much started. It is very kind of transdisciplinary, so there are people from all sorts of directions coming in. People with PhDs in literature of a particular linguistic community, linguistics obviously, but also from computer science, computer-based training, all sorts of different areas people have kind of entered into computer-assisted language learning. And that certainly shows in the research literature, that shows in the development, and that shows in the kind of pedagogic innovation. Especially in the early years, you had a couple of I mean, really in a kind of most positive way, you could call them hobbyists. So this was kind of language teachers who were really interested in saying, oh, these machines are great, let's do something with them. And they tried to learn some kind of programming code and put together little programs for their students to present them the next day. None of this was really very sustainable, and technology moved on very, very fast. And so there is a lot of knowledge that was gathered in computer-assisted language learning that was also lost over the years. We keep reinventing the wheel. The most kind of pertinent example is probably the advent of the internet. When you look at, and I'm sure all of you will have seen kind of little drill exercises, all sorts of language learning related websites, if you look at the actual content of those and the way they are done, they are still kind of 15 years into the internet, they're still kind of inferior to some of the things we used to be able to do on standalone computers in many ways. Now, in computer-assisted language learning these days, there's a lot of talk about computer-mediated communication. So these computers are not really used for kind of human-computer interaction, the student interacting with the computer by whatever filling out fill-in-the-blank exercise or doing some translation exercise or something like that. The computer is the tool that mediates communication. So the easiest example would be something like email, but you get these days the social media, you get things like wikis for collaborative writing spaces. You get kind of a lot for oral and visual communication if you think about tools like Skype that are used in language teaching and used at many different institutions at many different levels of language education. There is still a role, I would argue, for what people have termed tutorial call. So that's the kind of what we call in language pedagogy, we very often call this practice, so that the student really interacts with the computer. And the feedback very often, the corrective feedback comes from the computer. In the olden days, people also used to talk about something like courseware. They would write entire courses and basically burn them on a CD in the kind of 1980s, early 1990s, and then students, instead of picking up a textbook, they would get one of those CDs. Now these days, we do this with the online language learning courses, and that's a vast field, and it's a rapidly developing field. You will have all heard kind of snippets of news on the various media about these massive online, open online courses that certain universities kind of worldwide are putting up. And this has basically put the fear of God into some universities thinking, well, what's going to happen if Harvard puts on all those courses for us? So I don't think we can afford in language learning to just ignore this online world. There is also a clear student demand. At least my university, I can kind of vouch for that. We had student inquiries if we weren't using kind of a virtual learning environment platform. All of a sudden students said, yeah, but I'm using this in all the other courses. Why not in yours? What's happening there? This is a very diverse world. That's what I'm trying to do there with these adjectives. They're not to be understood as kind of binary. They're pretty much the ends of various continuant dimensions of these online language learning courses. You could synchronize the online course with an equivalent on-campus course. That's really all I mean with synchronized. Very often online courses are put on basically as additional sections for an existing course in order to enable wider student access. And of course, you can also have them independent. This is a bit too fast here, go back. You can base them then, especially with the synchronized, very often you'll base this, especially at the lower level courses, you'll base this on a textbook package with all the things these things come with today, or you write all the materials for that course. People have done this both ways. Online doesn't just mean kind of distance education or something, or purely online. People very often talk about blended learning. I don't like this metaphor of blended. It sounds too mushy in a way. So I prefer hybrid. That's what I mean there. So this is, you have an online presence for that course, but students also meet in class. either every week, or there are also other intervals in which this is done, or some residential week for certain courses and things like that, or a pure online course where students never kind of meet physically. They only meet via this online platform. And then coming back to whatever those metaphors I used in my explanation of computer-assisted language learning as a whole, of course, these online language learning courses can have elements that are more in tutorial call. So the traditional kind of exercises, what Michael Long would call focus on forms. So you do your exercises on the accusative case in German or something like that. And the computer provides feedback and has the kind of input and output mechanisms that the students need in order to kind of participate meaningfully in this interaction. Or you use it as a mediating tool, basically. Simple things would be discussion boards that are used very, very frequently and widely in many of the kind of language learning activities. I'm basing this presentation on a suite of 4 courses, 2 of which exist already. There are 2 elementary level courses for German and 2 intermediate level courses for German. When I say course in the context of the University of Waterloo, then I mean a semester-long course. So this is basically 2 years of learning German at university, pretty much. And my projects always need to have a name, otherwise I can't conceptualize them. So this project is called Gerla. And the courses in there, so this is the courses I'm talking about, they're purely online. Students do not meet, in spite of the fact that many of our so-called distance education students are actually on campus. They just register for these online courses for a variety of reasons. They have elements of both, the kind of tutorial elements, normal kind of language practice, and mediated where you use the computer as a tool for some kind of communicative practice, negotiation of meaning and things like that. They're synchronized, so all these courses are exactly parallel to existing on-campus courses. And that for a language like German is terribly important because it enables students to take the 101 online because they didn't have time that term because they were on co-op or something like that. And then the term after, they say, well, actually, I didn't like this computer that much. I'll register for the on-campus class. And they continue with German and then end up in our 102 class. And because the 2 are compatible, they should be kind of roughly at the same level as the other students who will have done the 101 on campus. And that, kind of student numbers, I don't need to give you the whole spiel there. I'm sure you get the picture. And for that reason, it's textbook-based, which has very interesting implications, I'd argue. What is it we wanted to achieve when we set out to kind of write these courses, basically? Because we give them the same number and designation, the same title, they ought to be qualitatively and quantitatively equivalent to the existing on-campus courses. Otherwise, we are cheating the students, basically, if we give them an inferior experience. And that kind of equivalence applies to the learning outcomes. So students need to be able, if we set the same written exam at the end, they need to be able to pass that exam with similar results as they would have had they taken the on-campus course. That's basically what I mean there with learning outcomes. That's achievable. Much more difficult is this learning experience. Language learning experience in the classroom. We heard a lot during the panel discussion about the kind of human factors in there. Communication is very much a kind of human feature. How do you at least simulate, approximate that online is one of the questions we kept asking ourselves. In order to create an experience that comes at least close to the experience students will have in a German language, Spanish language, French language, Russian language, whatever language classroom. And that mainly for us means we need to create plenty of opportunities for in-group communication and for communication also, of course, with the instructor. So that things similar to the classroom experience are likely to happen, that students get to know each other, of course, in a different way because they are online, but they get to know each other. They have a feeling of some kind of community and group in which they're studying. There's not this kind of lone person sitting in front of the computer. Now, from a kind of administrative perspective, we were told in no uncertain terms, you can only use the same resources as you would use for an on-campus course. So you can't have more TAs, or they cannot spend more hours and be present for longer hours. You can't have longer for developing these courses or whatever. So there are also resource constraints that need to be equivalent to the normal classroom-based courses. Now, we keep using buzzwords like information age, and we have this computer literate generation apparently now entering universities and whatever. Yes, these students do have a lot of experience with computers. They have little and sometimes no experience with language learning software or online language courses or anything. So there's still a lot they need to learn in that area, but they do come in with relatively high expectations in terms of interface design, reliability and robustness of these computer programs, because that's what they are used to. They're used to whatever, if there is an email functionality in the virtual learning environment, of course they expect this thing to work and have the same functionalities as whatever they email, their favorite mailbox thing they have on their computer or whatever. If you think about all the computer games they're playing, then you can think, well, kind of graphic design of the interface, easy, intuitive access to whatever the different facets and functionalities. All those have to be borne in mind when you design a course. I mean, you can't create a course that looks like whatever 1980s basically and present it to students in the 21st century. So that was our goals. As I said very briefly about the kind of underlying, I don't know, theoretical axioms, our thinking in some way. This is very much based on kind of applied linguistics. That's where I very often come from and where I take kind of my information from, basically. People like Larson Freeman, but also Nick Ellis, they've been talking a lot about conceptualizing language learning as a complex dynamic system. These complex dynamic systems, they're researched not only in the natural sciences and then in engineering, areas like dynamic systems theory, chaos theory, complexity science have also permeated many different areas in the social sciences and humanities. There's a lot going on in kind of pedagogy where people conceptualize systems basically as such and kind of looking at these variables in a non-reductionist way, which basically means in traditional experiments, you try to eliminate variables when you look at something because you want to just measure one thing. You want to see, if I give students a glossary, does that improve their vocabulary learning? And you try to eliminate all other factors that could possibly interfere with that in order to measure the usefulness of these glossaries. And then you end up with studies with contradictory results. So you'll find one study that says, yes, glossaries are good, give them. And the other one says, no, actually, I've got proof, they don't work. And the reason why this is so, in spite of the fact that both studies have kind of followed a valid, robust methodology, they've ignored contextual, sometimes minute variables, and have not taken them into consideration, but they did play a role. And in this complex systems approach, you're trying to kind of look at all these variables, and it's a dynamic system, so you don't even perceive them as static. You perceive them as constantly changing and interacting with one another. So in the course of the afternoon, we've been talking a lot about motivation. This would be one such kind of very global, very large variable. Of course, the motivation changes all the time, even in the course of a semester, depending on, for example, what results they achieve, what grades they get, how the teacher behaves, what the weather is like, and what the room temperature is like. So these variables interact with all sorts of other variables and change constantly. And that's what you're trying to kind of consider when you conceptualize and when you test certain things and when you carry out your studies, basically. Another way of looking at these systems, again, language learning as a system, is the cultural historic activity, theoretical lens. See the picture of Vygotsky up there. That's basically, people have also called this a social constructivist theory. Vygotsky very much believed that learning is a social practice. You can only learn in social interaction. This was in direct opposition at the time in the kind of 1920s, 30s, to other thinking in developmental and learning psychology in Europe. And he then started off, this is the theory with lots and lots of triangles. He started off with a fairly simple triangle. You have the subject, so in our case, the learners. You've got an object, which is basically the goal they're trying to achieve, like learn something. And this interaction between subject and object is always mediated, and it's mediated by artifacts. That's the kind of tip of the triangle there. In more modern versions of the theory, these triangles become more and more complicated. You then get a surrounding community that plays a role in which the subject sits. So all the other students at the university or in the course, in the program, but then also faculty members, instructors, TAs would be part of that community. You get division of labor rules, how this community actually interacts and how they divide things. And, well, I better move on, yeah. So this activity system in the sociocultural theory is very useful to then pick out all the different variables, players, stakeholders, components of the system. That's why we are looking at those two theoretical paradigms kind of in combination in some way. Back to Gerla. We started off developing online courses for German in 2001. You see this on the right-hand side. We did 3 courses. 101, 102 are basically our elementary German courses, and 201 is the first intermediate level German course. 2001, technologies don't move very fast into kind of pedagogy, never mind into universities. So we were still doing this kind of basically starting off with a set of HTML files that were empty, and we would kind of try to fill them. They were already arranged in a directory structure, and this is how we would write the web pages. This is how we started off. Then the University of Waterloo developed its own kind of platform. Basically, this is this UW1. That was then abandoned because it didn't lead very far and was far too costly and not very robust. And we bought in Angel, which is a platform that was produced by Indiana University in the US. They were then in turn bought by Blackboard. And then people started fearing, thinking, oh, Blackboard is a kind of Moloch. They are likely to increase prices and do all sorts of nasty things. So people moved on to Desire to Learn. This is this D2L there. So relatively short lifespan, I mean kind of 11, 12 years, we went through quite a number of iterations of different platforms that were used and basically forced upon us. This was beyond our control. The university simply changed the platform, and then we saw, oh, is somebody going to convert this stuff for us, and you know what's going to happen. So you constantly invent, reinvent, and basically do your maintenance. It's not just a question of writing these courses and then they're there like a book and you can kind of sell it every term. You constantly work on them because the technology changes, the books change, as you'll see later, all sorts of things happen. And that was the last thing that then happened. We kept using Vorsprung for quite a number of years. Our online courses basically got out of sync with the on-campus courses. We changed the book in the on-campus courses. It went to Berliner Platz, which is a book produced in Germany. And these textbook cultures in North America and Europe are rather different. I'm sure you can say the same thing for the teaching of other languages. So we had to kind of reconceptualize these courses. Right after lunch, I was listening to a talk where when people talked a lot about the communicative approach. If you want to have this kind of less or more communicative, then Berliner Platz is more communicative than the Vorsprung is, for example, in its focus. And that poses certain challenges for the online environment, as you're going to see in a second. So we're now trying to do 4 courses, and for the time being, we're still working with Desire to Learn, which is a kind of Waterloo-based company also. You always, you know, I'm German, I always look in the history, you know, I start with the origins of things. Where did we come from? And these tiny little things, this is the sensitivity to initial conditions. They play a large role. When we started off in 2001 working on the first set of courses, the courses before, we had distance education courses, but they were the normal things where cassettes would be shipped and little booklets and whatever, and students would send them back. And we were told right from the start, saying, well, look at how much resources in terms of TAs and instructors these cost. You can't have any more. So write your courses in such a way that in terms of grading and assignments and stuff the instructors will receive are going to be similar. You can kind of restructure this, but overall, it needs to be a kind of zero-sum game, basically. At the time, we didn't have instructors for these online courses in any real sense. They would be taught as kind of overload for a faculty member. So a faculty member would get his or her normal teaching load, and then they would be told, oh, and by the way, you do this online course, or you do this distance education course with whatever cassettes and paper. And that, of course, poses another set of challenges in some way. We wanted to structure the courses in such a way that we followed the task-based language teaching paradigm. So everything leads up to a communicative task, basically. There's different phases how you do this, but that's basically how you implement the communicative approach. And for research purposes, we wanted this equal lag time. So whenever students submit something, they should do so at regular intervals. I would believe this is also good pedagogic practice, but it's terribly important for gathering the research data. I need these regular lag times in order to be able to do kind of certain plots and see how they develop and what's happening there. If I get kind of data points, oh, here they've worked on something for 1 week and then they've worked on it for 3 weeks, I can't compare the two. But if I have something from them every week, I've got much more meaningful data from them, basically. Instructor module is basically so every student sees exactly the same thing in terms of instructional sequences and whatever. It doesn't get contextualized or it's not contingent upon their performance or anything. That's simply how these virtual learning environments work. I said earlier we wanted to replicate, simulate as many as possible of the features of the kind of classroom learning experience. And so we wanted to get the students together as a group, give them a chance to get to know each other, at least through their kind of language learning activities, and that they see what's going on there. How are we doing this? If you look at start on the top right there with the architecture. What do we actually have in this course? So we have an instructor module. I'm going to show you an example. It's basically, these are instructional sequences where the student gets told, do this now, do this now, do this now. This is the day of the week, do this, do this, do this. It's really kind of in very small steps, kind of taking them by the hand and saying, well, this is what's happening now. In order to be able to do that, because these are kind of mediated activities, they need a couple of learning objects. Very simple things. I mean, this could be a web page with some explanation. There's a lot of audio files so that the students would, in a classroom, they would normally hear almost everything that is in the textbook. Yeah, if you do an exercise with them together that is in the textbook, somebody is going to shout out the answer, even if you do this in kind of frontal teaching. So the other students are not just going to see the example in the book, they're also going to hear it. And we wanted to have something similar in this online course so that everything they see in the textbook, they can also hear. We need a couple of assessment objects, of course. In our case, these are a couple of quizzes, which I'll talk about later, and then the so-called drop boxes, so where students send in their assignments, both oral and written. Yeah, these drop boxes there's a recording button right next to them. All the student needs to do is hit that recording button, go to the Dropbox, hit the recording button, start talking to the computer. The file gets saved, they upload it, and their oral assignment is there, whatever, kind of leave a message on the answer machine or something like And obviously the same, kind of submitting a Word document, submitting a PDF file or something like that. This being a course, of course, you need a couple of administrative tools. Students need to authenticate when they come in so that you know who has done the quiz. You need to keep the grade book and all those things. They are normally built in. There's little, you need to configure those, but they're in the virtual learning environment. They're there for you. Classroom module. In the current version of the courses, we're really only using email and discussion boards. In the old one, we've also used chat. We simply gave them access to a chat tool and said, you go in there whenever you want. This is for you. This is not part of, kind of your learning experience as such. This is a bit like break. This is between classes. If you want to talk to your fellow students, if you've got questions or whatever, and you don't want to leave any record of those questions, we're not logging that chat room. Go in there, see whether anybody else is there and chat to them, ask your questions, or get together, meet at a certain time or whatever. In these discussion boards, the main one is, we simply call it questions and answers. That's where students ought to go and also do go first whenever they have any question. Whether the question is, do we really need to submit this on Friday? Or, I'm not sure where this is. So kind of the more logistical kind of questions, or whether that's a question on, oh, I saw this sentence there in the book, or I'm trying to do this exercise. I have no idea whether I'm doing this right. They would just, it's a bit like a frequently asked questions file. They would kind of submit this question there, would look whether other questions were submitted. The instructor also goes in. But most of the questions actually do get answered by the students. So that already is kind of a little community building. And this is in English, of course, so that students can actually ask these questions because they're beginners. All the German language discussion boards usually come in 3 steps. They're not really discussions. I mean, as I said, we're talking about beginners who, in the first week, they have a vocabulary of about 30 words or something like that. They're more like, I call them semi-public writing spaces. So student goes in, writes something, like introduces himself after the first week. Then he goes into the same discussion board again, reads somebody else's introduction, and is supposed to ask a question or leave a commentary or whatever, depending on genre and task and whatever. The second step varies by those things, basically. And then in the third step, they go in again and are supposed to read somebody else's submission and provide some feedback. In English, and the minimum feedback they need to leave is saying, well, yes, I read this. Looks good to me. I have no idea whether there's something wrong or not. I've seen it. So, and the students then perceive, this is a bit kind of, we're tricking them there, but they, of course, think, oh, that's the feedback I'm getting. The students believe, oh, I get feedback from the other students. How can that work? They're also beginners. Of course that doesn't work. And no, that's not the feedback they're getting. They're getting the feedback when they're doing the second and third reading. So actually the student who thinks they're giving feedback is getting feedback. Yeah, we basically make them kind of reflect on other students' writing, and that's how they should kind of notice little errors in their own writing, because that's what most of them most likely do is they read somebody else's, and in their mind they compare to the little text they have written, because that's the only yardstick they have at that stage. We use it because it's Berliner Platz, which is a square in a town called Bielefeld. We use a lot of travel metaphors in this course, so you get your start and your finish, and you get a couple of tours. So we've got 10 tours in the 101, which is basically the equivalent of a chapter in the book. Each tour lasts a week, and the weeks, for a variety of reasons, for us always start on a Wednesday. I'll show you in a second why. They start off with getting gas. This is Auftanken. This Berliner Platz book is very, very heavy on vocabulary. So we need to do some vocab priming and front loading. It's ugly, and students don't like it very much, but that's the only way they can kind of, at that pace, get through that book. So we do a lot of vocab activities basically on the first day of the week. And in order to make sure that they actually do it, because this is a German course, so there's a check afterwards. So they get a quiz and a vocab quiz, basically where the gas level is checked before they embark on this particular leg. Then you've got a couple of 5 legs which basically contain, they're hour-long. So students are always told, kind of make room for an hour at the time, because one of the things with these online courses is kind of time management of the students, kind of them falling behind and stuff. So we structure this by the week, and we structure this by the hour and tell them, well, you can do those hours whenever you want to, but if you do sit down in front of the computer, reserve at least an hour. There's not much point in you kind of sitting down for any less, and you should work 8 hours a week on a particular course. So you get these kind of 6 basically with all sorts of activities, and then we've got the police check. So there's another quiz there, which acts in 2 different ways. It's a normal quiz that is graded and, you know, kind of best out of something, then they get a grade for. But it also acts as a kind of gatekeeper. They can only see the Dropbox for a graded assignment, which is this Anreise, the arrival, if they pass this quiz, the police check, with a minimum of 60%. The reason why we have to do that is, we didn't do this at first, students submit utter gobbledygook. There are some students, as a tiny minority, who believe, oh, I know some German, I'll get by in this course, it's just an online course. I go in once a week and do this assignment, get some kind of grade for it, and I'll be fine, I passed that course and I meet my language requirement and I'm done. Which of course gives a hard time to our TAs and instructors, because you're going to correct this gobbledygook. I mean, it takes you much, much longer. So we're basically trying to prevent them from submitting a text if they haven't done any work at all, because it's then almost illegible, basically. The reason why we start on Wednesdays has to do with the grading schedule. If we started on the Monday, they would submit the task. At the end of the week would then be Sunday, which is kind of the traditional German way. For Germans, the week starts on Monday. And that would mean that this police check, which they need to pass, and there are a couple of things the instructor needs to grade. There are always 2 items in there that are not graded by the computer, they are graded by the instructor. That would mean the instructor would need to grade them always on the weekend, because they come in Friday night, and then the instructor needs to have them graded so that the students can actually submit their task. They would sit there every weekend. Kind of hadn't dawned on me when we designed that course. It dawned on the coordinator pretty quickly. So we simply moved this by 2 days and said, all right, we have a little longer first week, or a little shorter, depending on how the semester falls. We start on the Wednesday, and then Thursday night they do the vocab quiz. Sunday night they do this police check, the second quiz, basically structural language quiz. And then on Tuesday night they submit the task. If it's graded, to the Dropbox. If it's not graded, it's just a participation grade. Then it goes to one of those discussion boards with the 3-step process, so that, you know, kind of fellow students see what everybody has written and they get some kind of community feel there. This is what these instructional sequences look like. So they're prefaced with all sorts of links to glossary and saying pay attention to this and do this and look for this. And then they're always aligned with the textbook. That's simply the page number then in the textbook materials, color-coded, depending on whether this is in the workbook or in the textbook. And we have aligned them so they don't just go through the book one after the other. Students could do this by themselves. We have clustered them in kind of meaningful ways so that whatever these sequences make some sense. And then in the rightmost column, you get the links to additional resources that students might need. Audio files, the P is what we call prof sort. So there's a little presentation, could be a little video clip, could be a little kind of narrated PowerPoint or something like that, where the prof actually does go in, explains something, gives it additional hints or whatever, stuff that is not explained sufficiently in the textbook, or where we know that our students are struggling and they wouldn't be able to make sense by themselves on the textbook materials. Yeah, what's kind of more or less in summary, what's happening there? What we tried is we have a very systematic and regular structure for that course, and that's not just because this is a German course or something. It helps students a lot. They struggle during the first week quite a bit to get used to the pace, when do I have to end in what, but they also know, once they've understood, once they've even done it for 1 week, knowing, oh, gee, yeah, I better sit down on Wednesdays and get all that vocab stuff done, because I need to hand in this quiz by Thursday night. So, you know, I need to structure my time accordingly, and that happens every week for 10 weeks. So they get used to it pretty quickly. Because there's always new material, this very regular structure, I don't think gets boring. I've never had any complaints that students said, you know, it was boring. The complaints we do get from students are about, oh, this is far too much workload, we are doing far too much. We are being asked to write so much, we are being asked to speak so much, and we have to read all these things. There's so much material here. And we get occasional complaints with, oh, I hardly have any interaction with a real professor. I don't want to be graded by other students and get feedback from students or whatever. I want my professor to read the stuff I've written. In many terms, there's not a single professor on these courses. It's very often a staff instructor who coordinates them. We do this task-based language teaching. It's basically done through the Anreise. This arrival task is always a genuine task. So it's a communicative task that provides some context. It has some relevance, and it's kind of negotiation of meaning, all those things you'd expect from communicative language teaching. We have to live with this vocabulary front-loading. Because of this is a bit textbook-driven, but also curriculum-driven at the university, these courses have a very steep progression. We kind of push them up very quickly through the 101, 102. They're covering a lot of ground, and that's also one of the reasons why they complain about the workload. But from that, we and the students benefit in kind of later courses if they decide to continue after the kind of beginner level German. There are lots of cultural elements through the book, but also through the interaction. A lot of the TAs are exchange students from Germany, so they do have interaction with native speakers. Weekly quizzes, I explained. We've got 4 graded of these communicative tasks in order to reduce the grading load for TAs. That was one reason. They do a task every week, but the other 6 are simply not graded. They only get peer feedback. It costs a lot of time and energy to write these courses, in spite of the fact that we do not create an additional set of exercises. Yeah, we've written those quizzes and stuff, but we haven't written sets and sets of exercises or anything, because we're using the wealth of material that is in the textbook package, on the web pages of the publisher and all this kind of stuff. But it's still an enormous amount of work. We need ongoing maintenance. So every term there's something that changes in these courses. They are not static in many ways. Through the textbook ties, I mean, publishers get nastier and nastier, in my opinion, by kind of publishing a new edition, I don't know, every 18 months or something like that. And then, you know, as soon as the pagination changes, we are changing our instructional sequences, and it's kind of tedious to kind of go through and make all those little changes. And of course, it's the technology that changes underneath, the virtual learning environment changes. Of course, things go wrong. I make mistakes kind of writing these things in. Other mistakes happen. Lots of things that can happen there. The main problem we have, not only for these online language courses, but in computer-assisted language learning in general, nothing to do with the language as such, is the technology transfer. There are lots and lots of useful tools out there. Some of them are implemented in these virtual learning environments already. but you simply do not have the resources and the time, or sometimes the expertise to incorporate them immediately. And sometimes there's not much point, quite frankly, to kind of implement everything that is there. Because you want, it's still like you would enter a classroom. You want a robust teaching experience. You want to use things that you know are going to go right, are not going to mess up your entire kind of lesson plan or something like that. It's the same thing in online language learning. What we're trying to do is the same as it's the same as we're trying to do in classrooms. It's what I would call pedagogic transparency. We had this in the panel here. I very much believe that it is very important. Our students are educated adults, intelligent enough to understand that we're trying to manipulate them basically when we teach them. So we should at least make this transparent and say, well, this is my goal, this is what I'm doing, these are the methods I'm using, this is what's happening to you. Either you buy in or you don't, leave it or, but you can understand what's going on there. We do quite considerable training for our TAs, so they're kind of weekly workshops, TA workshops, where they get some training. Less so, unfortunately, for the ones who kind of work online, because the majority of TAs, of course, works in these on-campus classes, so they get better training proportionally, because more topics are relevant to them. But they do get a lot of training in kind of grading, lesson plans, all sorts of things. What does communicative actually mean and all those things. And we have relatively good technical support from some department, which is, in our case, it's not called distance education anymore, they're now called Center for Extended Learning. What can we conclude so far? On these old courses, we did a very thorough study by testing the students kind of a lot. And we found that the students in the online section who had volunteered to take this course online, so they wanted to take it online, achieved equivalent results to the on-campus sections in a variety of aspects and really kind of robust study. But the main thing here is these students wanted to take German online. So they had a different set of motivation. This wasn't your average kind of online course participant. Some of them have to take it online because of geographic distance or something like that, or scheduling difficulties. The learning experience is, of course, different. This is online, so things happen differently. But the majority, and this is anecdotal there, we haven't really done a good study yet, the majority of feedback we had is positive. So students take this as a positive. You always get a couple of disgruntled to say, oh, never ever again, why did I take this online? And with kind of about 200 students a term taking these courses. For us, this is 200 additional students taking German at university, which is a wonderful boost. And it's kind of 200 students who have potentially access to these, to a language learning experience of some kind, and they might otherwise not have had that opportunity for a variety of reasons. I would argue that they have very similar opportunities in terms of language learning. Traditionally, people are always suspicious, saying, oh yeah, but they can't speak, can they? Yes, of course they can. They probably speak more in these online courses. If they are conscientious learners, if they really do everything we tell them to do, they probably speak more than the average student in your classes. We have classes for German of 25 students, and they are 50 minutes long. So do the math. I mean, this is 2 minutes per student. But 50% of the time, probably the instructor is speaking anyway, so this is 1 minute per student in any class. So this is 4 minutes a week, because they've got 4 classes a week and 12 weeks. So they have spoken for 48 minutes in the entire term. They can easily do this online. They can do this in 1 day. because they have to record all those things and somebody will actually listen to this stuff. And their fellow students have a chance to listen to it. And the same thing, of course, applies to writing. And there's, of course, a wealth of input in terms of reading and listening materials because of whatever, huge load of sound files and stuff like that. Technology transfer I've already spoken to. Language learning online, I would argue, is more complex than language learning in class, both from a kind of pedagogic perspective, so as the instructor or designer of these courses, as well as from a research perspective, simply for the fact that we're introducing additional variables. Everything else really does remain the same. The goals remain the same. They still want to learn German. The instructor still wants to teach them German with all that goes with it. But now we have this element of technology that plays a role and kind of changes the picture somewhat and is interacting with all sorts of other variables that are part of that language learning system. So all in all, yes, it is a high cost, but I would argue it's also a high gain. This is maybe even the future of part of our profession. I'm not saying kind of all of language learning will ever go online, or nor should it, but the component is going to increase. Okay, there it is. Thank you.